The question now is that the amendments be agreed to, and I call the honourable member for Deakin.
Well, thanks very much, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker. I obviously rise in support of the Labor 2013-14 budget savings measures #1 bill. And it's quite an extraordinary set of circumstances that lead us here today to put this bill in front of the House to remind the Labor Party that they are now blocking savings worth $2.8 billion over the forward estimates that they took to the last election. Now, speakers on this side of the House have gone through in ad nauseum the irony of that approach and how irresponsibly reckless and, quite frankly, for the Labor Party, how embarrassing it is. I mean, for a Labor Party person to walk into this House and say, I campaigned with this as part of our policy manifesto before the last election and now we're voting against it, even though we left the budget in a parlous condition, I find extraordinary. I think they should really hang their heads in shame, and it's absolutely unbelievable that they would block these savings measures. Obviously, we've repealed the carbon tax. We've repealed the carbon tax. We've delivered household savings of $550 per year for the average household. So we no longer have to continue with the second round of compensation and tax cuts that was associated with the original carbon tax proposal from the Labor Party. So on what basis could you argue that that $2.8 billion that Labor itself took to the last election, that we agreed to before the last election, should not pass this House is quite extraordinary. The Labor Party, unfortunately, view government in a very unusual way. And in my view, the problem with the former Labor government, and quite frankly, they're unreconstructed over there in opposition, the problem with the Labor Party is they view government as a big spending competition. They think that you go to an election and you promise to spend more than the other mob and you'll get elected. And they run around the country and treat it like a spending competition. Well, let me say to the Labor Party, if that is what government in this country is, well, we won't participate in that. We can never win that fight because we know Labor will always spend more. If it's a pure spending competition, well, Labor will govern forever. But the problem is, if Labor governs forever, we will end up like the worst European budgets, the most parlous fiscal circumstances, and the Australian people know that. I must say to the opposition, the Australian people know that. And for somebody to walk out into the street and tell their constituency that they are voting against saving measures in the fiscal environment that we face now, that the Labor Party took to the last election, I think is absolutely embarrassing. No one should forget that when we came to government, debt was projected to rise to $667 billion. We had $123 billion of cumulative deficits over the forward estimates. When debt peaked, as it was projected to at $667 billion, it would cost $3 billion a month in interest payments. $3 billion a month. $133 million a day in borrowings that the government would have to enter into just to keep the lights on, not to actually do anything, not to build infrastructure, not to build the productive capacity of our nation, but $133 million a day just to keep the lights on. Well, thankfully, with the election of the Abbott coalition government, we understand that that's not sustainable. The Australian people understand that's not sustainable. And the fact that the opposition are in so much denial over the debt and deficit disaster that they've left this country is the only way that I can explain that they would continue down this reckless path of blocking savings such as these. This should be a no-brainer. This should be $2.8 billion that we can bank to the bottom line. And given we're still looking at debt and deficits for a number of years, the Labor Party need to assist. The Labor Party need to repent for their sins in government and go a small way in helping us get to that point. But the Labor Party's got form here. This $2.8 billion of their own savings that they are now forgetting about are in addition to other savings of their own that they're blocking, including the change of Labor's student start-up scholarships, which was a $2.1 billion savings measure, a change to apply an efficiency dividend to university funding, the abolition of the discount for paying HECS fees up front, a $336 million saving. All of these savings measures that the Labor Party took to the last election that they no longer believe need to be made. Now, we are absolutely determined on this side of the House to fix the budget. We don't believe that engaging in intergenerational theft is something that should be on the conscience of any government. So I appeal to the Labor Party. If you're not too ashamed, if you're not too embarrassed to be blocking these savings measures, look into your own conscience and look at the fact that the next generation of Australian taxpayers will ultimately be the people who pay the price for Labor's profligacy. Now, as I said at the beginning, I mean, the fact that we are even having this debate and the fact that we've got to this point is a culmination of a fairly extraordinary set of circumstances. An opposition leader and a shadow treasurer who are in absolute denial about the former Gillard-Rudd government's fiscal inheritance to this country. But I would appeal to the backbenchers in the opposition. These are the kind of measures that we should be able to get together on in this House, make them happen, because future governments in this country, future governments on both sides of the House in this country, one way or another are going to have to tackle these issues. And if the Labor Party are going to take measures to an election that they then repudiate afterwards, presumably just to make life a bit more difficult, I find quite extraordinary, and as a relatively new member to this House, never ever thought would be an argument or a discussion that we would have to have. Now, obviously, these budget savings measures are being discussed in the context of a very, very well-received budget. Particularly in my electorate of Deakin, I can say that the small business tax measures have gone down very well. The Jobs for Families package has been absolutely welcomed by my electorate. But I want to highlight why the juxtaposition of those measures and the measure that the Labor Party is blocking today. There are ways that governments can improve confidence, can improve the productive output of our economy with quite modest expenditure. In my view, the small business tax cuts, and most particularly the accelerated depreciation, being to write off capital equipment up to the value of $20,000 in the year in which you purchase, is going to have such an impact on confidence that ultimately I think the tax receipts that confidence will engender will outweigh any cost to the budget of the accelerated depreciation. And that's where governments need to be now. That's the space we need to be at. How can tax measures, how can tax policy encourage economic growth, encourage economic activity, encourage the entrepreneurial spirit of this country, because that's going to be one of the important ways that we ultimately get out of the debt mess that Labor left us. Sure, we need expenditure restraint, and we inherited expenditure running away at over 3.5% growth per year. Sure, we need to ensure that our tax system is more efficient as well. But ultimately, if we're going to get Labor's debt under control, there'll also need to be an element of increased confidence, increased economic activity to grow the pie and grow tax receipts. And that's where we need to be making those investments when we're tweaking tax policy. So accelerated depreciation, in my view, is going to have a negligible impact on the bottom line because I think the economic activity that flows from it is going to ultimately outweigh any short-term cost to the budget. And here you've got Labor blocking $2.8 billion of savings that they took to an election that are just going to be a drag on the bottom line. They're not going to increase participation, increase the productive capacity of this country, increase confidence. They are just going to be a hit on the bottom line. And the other example I'd use is our Jobs for Families package. Sure, we are making a huge additional investment, particularly in childcare. But again, I think that investment will ultimately be outweighed by the increased productivity that will flow from parents either re-entering the workforce sooner than they otherwise would or being employed for longer every week than they otherwise would. So working that extra half a day, doing that extra couple of hours each day, or going back to work a bit earlier because it makes sense. The costs of childcare are no longer a disincentive to going back to work. So again, that $3.5 billion additional investment in childcare, which is already many, many billions of dollars in the budget, but the additional $3.5 billion, in my view, will unlock economic potential, economic activity, and most importantly, the participation of parents in the workforce, which again, in the long term, will have a positive impact on the bottom line. So I say to Labor, this is the space that governments have to be in. How do we tweak tax policy? How do we reform tax policy to grow the pie? To grow the pie. And then that will have spin-off benefits for the government in hopefully increased tax receipts, not because we're increasing each dollar more, but because the pie is bigger. And that's ultimately how we're going to get to where we need to be, which is running budget surpluses. And unfortunately, a big misconception in the community is that once you run a budget surplus, you can celebrate. Unfortunately, with the debt that we are inheriting from Labor and have inherited from Labor, we're going to have to run surpluses for many, many, many years to pay the annual interest bill and to pay the capital amount of the debt. I mean, I was a relatively young kid when the Howard government first was elected, but it took them 10 years to pay off $96 billion of debt. 10 years to pay off $96 billion of debt. Now, we've gone a long way in reducing the $667 billion debt trajectory that we inherited. But there's well over $300 billion that we will have to repay. And it will take a lot longer than 10 years to repay that debt. So even though we will, I'm very confident, get to surplus, a believable, a credible, fair surplus under Treasurer Hockey, the job will only have begun then. The job will only have begun. And we'll never get the job done as a country if this absolute mindless opposition to savings measures that you took to an election continues. And I say to the Labor Party, if you think Australians are that silly, I think you're going to be sorely mistaken. In this country, if you vacate the space on fiscal reform and improving the budget bottom line, then you are so out of touch with where the Australian public is that you're in real trouble. So I say to the Labor Party, you should be reflecting on this, and I'd encourage you to support this bill because these are sensible budget savings. They're savings to remove compensation and tax cuts associated with a carbon tax which no longer exists, So it makes absolute sense for this House to pass them. Let's do it quickly and let's deliver these benefits for the budget and, most importantly, the Australian
The
people.
member's time has expired. The question now is that the amendments be agreed to. I call